good to see everyone this morning. It's good to be here today. I pray you had a good week and most things went your way. We're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 11 this morning. We're going to, Lord willing, try to pick up where we left off last week. Last week we were studying how the enemy had came into the land, into Jabesh Gilead, and Jabesh Gilead had sent messengers out to the rest of Israel to see whom would help. We talked about the reason that they feared there might not be help. And then we saw last week, we more or less left off where this news came to Saul. And Saul was this first king of Israel, was out in his father's field seeing after the herds. And that was their king. And he actually had to go to the news when he came out of the field to get it. And we left off, we read verse 7, and we left off there. So I think for review and just to kind of, we're going to try to do the whole chapter this morning. Let's read all of chapter 11. It says, Then Nahash, the Ammonite, came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh said unto Nahash, Make a covenant with us, and we will serve thee. And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, On this condition will I make a covenant with you, that I may thrust out all your right eyes, and lay it for reproach upon all Israel. And the elders of Jabesh said unto him, Give us 7 days respite, that we may send messengers into all the coast of Israel. And then, if there be no man to save us, we will come out to thee. Then came the messengers of Gibeah of Saul, and told the tidings in the ears of the people, and all the people lifted up their voices and wept. And behold, Saul came after the herd out of the field, and Saul said, What aileth the people that they weep? And they told him the tidings of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. And he took a yoke of oxen, and he hewed them in pieces, and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel by the hands of messengers, saying, Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done unto his oxen. And the fear of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out with one consent. And when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000, and the men of Judah 30,000. And they said unto the messengers that came, Thus shall ye say unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, Tomorrow by the time the sun be hot ye shall have help. And the messengers came and showed it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, Tomorrow we will come out unto you, and ye shall do with us all that seemeth good unto you. And it was so that on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together. And the people said unto Samuel, Who is he that said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men that we may put them to death. And Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel. Then said Samuel to the people, Come and let us go to Gilgal, and renew the kingdom there. And the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal, and there they sacrificed sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Now we taught 6 or 7 verses last week. We're gonna try to get through this chapter today. But we saw a humble man. Last week we saw a group of people that were looking to men to be their salvation. And then last week we read 7, but we really left off in 6, where it says the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he heard those tidings, and his anger was kindled greatly. And I think we said it was a just anger because it was a godly anger. So the Spirit of God came upon Saul, and God has him respond this way. God gave him the wisdom to deal with this in front of everyone. Saul was being watched closely, and very closely by some, because there were some that didn't like him. And when the Spirit came in, it took over, I believe. And he had to get it right. And let's be honest, like the rest of us, Saul had to earn the trust. These people were watching him, and just because he was anointed, just because they asked for him, just because they were going to live and die by what he did, it didn't mean that maybe maybe they trusted him personally. So this response had to be right. There were people there watching. So what he does in verse 7 is he sends out a summons of sorts. And it's a call for the people of Israel to show up. It's showing what is happening. This, I don't know how else to describe it because he was in his 30s. But it's almost like that morning he was king. And he went out in the field a boy. And when he came back and the Spirit filled him, he was a man. He was different. And he's a king now. And so this summons that's sent out has authority. It's not a shepherd asking for help in defending his land. It is a king asking the nation to help defend itself. It's different. This is his first act. His first act, let's get together and let's defend what God's given us. My first act, let's get together and defend God's people. It was showing this nation of Israel that Saul's power has now passed from within his own family or his own tribe. And he is king. His power now extended to this entire nation. Now, there's a couple of different ways to look at the way this call went out. And I'm going to say this is an opinion. But we see in the middle of verse 7, it says, "Whosoever cometh not forth after Saul and after Samuel." There's a couple of different ways we can look at that. And I'm going to present them both, and you choose what you like. Saul includes Samuel's name and his office. It's a sign of reverence would be the first way to look at that. A sign of humility of the first king, a sign of respect to me. It's saying it's not all about me. This power Samuel had, and he allowed me to be a part of it. He's including Samuel in. We can share this power. This is a great responsibility. Samuel has knowledge. He has experience. He knows more to me. And this call that is sent out comes from not only your king, but the man of God who has served this nation for so many years. That's one way. It's almost like he's saying it doesn't have to be about me, not me only. One thing about Saul here, he didn't have to show or prove that he could do all this on his own. He had help. Samuel was still there. Later on, he was unwilling to wait for that help. But right now, well, the Spirit's in him. He's including him. And that's a personal application we have to make. It's a conviction where we get over ourselves and over our own pride. Everything about the flesh wants to react a certain way. Your flesh naturally wants to raise itself up. You naturally want your name to be better. But then the Spirit in you is saying it's about God. It's not about you. Your reputation doesn't matter. That's the moment I see that when he's including Samuel's name here. It's a reminder that this kingdom isn't about one man. So then we could also argue the other side of that. This is the other side. That in the flesh we've all done this. We use someone else's name for credit or credibility. That Saul may know that if it's just his name, there may not be as many show up as if it's Samuel doing the call. I think of it in sales. I think we see this all the time. You're trying to present yourself, so you use someone else's name, someone else's reputation to talk to that person. Your credibility is based off someone else's word. And that's really what's, you could make that argument that that's what Saul's doing here. He's using this other person's reputation for his own gain, which may or may not happen down the road, but you could almost look at it like it's a name drop for credibility. That Saul needed Samuel's name or reputation to get the people to respond the way they needed to, or to make his word more valuable. So, what about this verse 7? It says he took a yoke of oxen and hewed them in pieces and sent them throughout all the coast of Israel. That's a different way of getting attention, isn't it? We don't see that all the time in the Bible. It's unique. I think he's sitting there and he hears the news. The Spirit comes on him and he's calm. He's reserved. He's in control. And God's giving him directions. God's providing that calmness. What man is just sitting there of his own knowledge and says, hey, if I cut this up and send it out, I'm going to make an example? That is divine wisdom that was given to him that day. This newfound king just gave a penalty if this order wasn't followed out. So in one moment we see him come out of the field as a tending to his father's flock, or his herd. I don't know why I say that. And the next moment he's telling the nation, if you don't show up, this is what's going to happen. That's a mighty big change. So if the orders aren't followed out, this is the penalty. This is a show of power. All the people would see Saul and the authority that was given to him, that there was a consequence to disobedience. Just a quick reminder, we're going to talk about it in a moment, but he says in this verse, if you don't come forth, so shall it be done unto his oxen. That was their tractor. That was their way of life. Now this wasn't a severe, I'm getting ahead of myself, but this was a deeper threat than maybe we see at this day and time. We'll pick up on that here in a minute. So Saul hewed a yoke of oxen in pieces, and he sends it out to several different cities, to different regions. Now, depending on who you read and who you don't, how far these messengers were actually sent out is questionable to some people. Did everyone hear about this? I'm not sure, but we know 300,000 of Israel and 30,000 of Judah showed up, so we can assume a good portion of the land heard about this. But a yoke of oxen, that's a pair. If you think about it, that's a lot of meat. That's a lot of example being sent out. So we have a number there. But more or less, he sent out an example. This is what you're going to find in your barn or in your field if you don't show up. They were looking at the results of disobedience. This was a literal example in Deuteronomy 28:31, if you'll turn there. It shall not be done unto you, but unto your oxen. So Deuteronomy 28:31, it reads this. It says, thine ox shall be slain before thine eyes, and thou shalt not eat thereof. Thine ass shall be violently taken away from before thy face, and shall not be restored to thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. So this was a penalty from God here, but it's to get your attention. It's not as severe as your own life or your own family. It's not that kind of threat, but it was going to make the point. It was going to cost you something. The point, you may live, but life was going to get hard. Okay, that was the point that was trying to be made here. So back in 1 Samuel, we'll keep talking about verse 7. This worked. This wisdom, this hewing of the oxen, and then sending it out. This worked because God worked it. God gave the wisdom to Saul, and then it says that the fear of the Lord fell on the people. How in control is God? I mean, why do we wrestle with him for power? He gave the wisdom. He gave the fear. He gave the meat. He let the enemy come into the land. He gave the results. I mean, who are we to question that kind of power and that kind of control? God's always in control, even when we're scared and the enemy's in the land, when we're new at something, when we're overwhelmed. God's still God. We can rest in that. When we stand boldly and we know we're doing what God would have us to do, he's in control. And we feel encouraged. But even when we're discouraged, God's still in control. It's not in our flesh to say, oh, you're going to take my ox and do that? Yeah, I'll come fight with you. No, we're like, no, you're not. Our flesh wants to fight and argue that. The fear of the Lord, God gave 100%. He had this planned out so far in advance. And we read over it. I know we all know, but we read over it like it's nothing. There's power, control, wisdom given, fear fell. That's our God. must never forget his power, but we must strive to know his will, to pray to always be in his will. And then we'll see and know this kind of control. The God that gave deliverance in verse 11 is the same God that brought the enemy in verse 1. What he did, what Saul did, had an effect on the nation. They came out as one man. It doesn't say they feared Saul. It doesn't say Saul caused this. God got the honor and glory. Can a man unite an entire group of people like this? No. That's how a church works. It's not. We can't even come in and get along on paint color. But God can come in and make us all come in of one mind and in 100% agreement. God called the people. God caused the fear. God had control. God causes man to see past all the problems and unite on what really matters. What happened had no regard to Saul other than God was allowing him to share the victory. Verse 8, it says, and when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel were 300,000 and the men of Judah 30,000. Saul numbered them. Now, God didn't tell him to, but to me this was I'm new at this. Saul had never done this before. He'd never been here. He gave a command to someone, and that someone listened and went out and counted the people. Now you know how many showed up, but it was almost like an accountability call. Who's not here? The penalty given would be followed out later if we count. You know, Saul had the authority to order this. I can't, I know I keep beating it to death, but the rapid change in one man that quick. To give a command and then to go to battle, and he's like, hey, go count the people, you do this, you do this. Nothing but the Spirit of God can do that. Nothing but the Spirit of God can change a man like that. Saul had authority to order this. Maybe counting the people would help him to know their strength, know when and where to distribute each wave, where and how many to have on each flank. I don't know. But he didn't grow up being taught these things. I didn't grow up wanting to come to church. The Spirit of God, whenever God saved me, things changed. It was different. The call was different. This was a godly wisdom given to him. There had never been an organized government before, and we see these things happening just like Saul went to school for it and grew up under it for 3 generations. He takes control, never having experience. God can qualify. Saul had never led a group of people, a little less organized the militia. We're not going to teach this today, but we will give it an honorable mention. We see Judah mentioned in this verse here, 30,000. We're going to talk about it later, but this is a mention of the tribe of David. David mentioned for the first time underneath Saul's kingship. We talked about Jacob's prophecy about how the king would come out of this tribe, the bloodline, the lineage of Christ. We'll get into all that, Lord willing, later on. But we see it mentioned here, and it's not mentioned on accident. So, lesson for later on in the future. Verse 9. It says, and they said unto the messengers that came, thus shall ye say unto the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun be hot, ye shall have help. And the messengers came and showed it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. These messengers are waiting to see how many show up. They go and they tell the news. They come to Gibeah. They're telling the people of the trouble. The new king comes from the field. He's tending his herds. You don't have any hope. You don't have any strength when you see him come. And then the Spirit of the Lord comes on him, and nobody else sees it. And he hews these oxen, and he gives these commands. And they're allowed to witness that day. And maybe these same messengers carried that meat out to the surrounding areas. Who else would better sell that? It concerned them the most. They would present that message the best. This is from the new king. We need your help. If you don't come, this is what's going to happen to your oxen. The enemy's there. They're wanting our right eyes. Versus if I'm pitching it for it, hey, there's something going on in Jabesh. Here's some meat. I'm not sure what all's going on. But the urgency was different because of who it came from. It says, tomorrow by the time the sun be hot. So, we got a western there. That's noon, right? It says, we'll be there. That's sooner than the enemy demanded. Saul, God wasn't going to waste any time. You be ready to do your part, and we're going to be there. And it says when they heard it, they were glad. The victory wasn't guaranteed, but they were glad. A little hope goes a long way. At least we got a chance. They're coming to help. They care about us. They love us. All the things in the past. One could look at this as public forgiveness for what we read last week. As in, okay, well, you never showed up to wipe out Benjamin like the rest of us, but we are, as a nation, coming to help you. At least now they know if they perish, they know they're a part of a nation, and they're going to at least be able to put up a fight. My thought is whether the people of Israel showed up or not, they were going to fight, I think. Who's going to willingly volunteer for torture? Yeah, just take the eye. It's cool. So at least now they have hope that they're going to be able to at least put up a fight. A side note, but Saul is the only one who knew the Spirit came upon him. And without a doubt, he knew that it was God, and he knew he was right there, and he knew he was in God's will. How rare is that? To know that you know that you know that what you're doing is what God wants you to do. That's a rare thing. We struggle with that. And even though we know that we know about 99% of it, there's always a step of faith, right? So I believe it was an encouraging moment for it. Let's look at verse 10. It says, "Therefore the men of Jabesh said, Tomorrow we will come out unto you, and ye shall do with us all that seemeth good unto you." The word in this verse, to me, you could almost lead the enemy astray. They didn't mention, they just go and report to the enemy that it's them coming out. We're going to come out against you, and you just do whatever seems good. We're going to fight, but we know we don't stand a chance is almost what they're saying. So you just do whatever seems good. If you decide to show mercy, we're good with that. So would the enemy send out scouts? Would they be watching? Would they be expecting? I don't think so, because he wouldn't have gave them time if he did. They thought this might be like 100 times before when they went out to war. This is an easy victory. So we'll look at verse 11 now. Verse 11 is where we see the result of the faith. It says, "And it was so on the morrow that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the host in the morning watch, and slew the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And it came to pass that they which remained were scattered, so that 2 of them were not left together." How did Saul know to do this? Have you ever done something and you had no clue how to do it? Where's that wisdom come from? The first time you do something in a church, the first time you teach, or you take a role, you see other people do it. You've never done it yourself. It's different. Never done it before. Never seen it. Maybe he'd heard of war, but there's no evidence that he was a man of war. God qualifies his man. You know, I've seen the Lord call people to preach, and it blew me away. I'm not going to lie. But God qualified them. When the Spirit of the Lord comes upon somebody, there's wisdom given, and the Spirit drives. God's leading through Saul. He was not bred for war. He had never led people, never organized an army. He did not study at West Point. God gave all the men at West Point their knowledge of how to fight a war, and God just threw it on Saul. He never even had to go to class. This vast army, this militia of Israel would travel some 60 miles crossing the River Jordan to get there. Man doesn't organize like that. Not on the spot. I mean, this is read like it happened in a matter of days. God organized it like we would our pantry. Well, I mostly use beans and carrots, so that's going to be toward the front. We're going to put the Brussels sprouts toward the back. I mean, that's how God brought these men forth and moved them. I don't know if Brussels sprouts go in the pantry. I don't eat that. But that's our God. And yet, you know what we're going to do? We're going to doubt this week. We're going to doubt that kind of control. We're going to doubt that kind of organization. We're going to doubt that kind of power. Even if we're growing older and we're wiser and we're not doubting it for more than a few minutes, and then us younger folk are probably going to doubt it for a few days, we're still doubting. That's still a sin. God gave the pieces. He moved the pieces around. He provided and he qualified. I love that it's a 10-verse build-up to a 1-verse delivery. Have you noticed that? We sit there and we'll toil on something for weeks. We'll worry about it. We'll get sick. We'll literally make our stomachs hurt. And then in a matter of 30 minutes, that problem goes away. Now, not always. But I think if we were all being honest, 90% of the time, we worry longer than the solution. 10 verses of build-up, and in 1 verse, God comes in and gives victory. That's our God. Quit worrying. Fall in line. March to Jabesh Gilead. Victory's coming. Quit letting the problem take 10 verses for a 1-verse solution. That's the key. God allowed Saul to keep his word. Saul said, if you don't do this, this is what's going to happen. But we're going to battle here. Now, what would happen? Let's just be honest. When we say that, what do we think of? Or I think of David, shall I pursue this troop? Will you give me victory? We didn't see that because the Spirit was in Saul, and Saul said, this is what's going to happen. And God allowed Saul to keep his word. They came during the morning watch, early in the morning, and slew to the heat of the day. Saul was going to be seen different. A king who is able to keep his word is a king you are going to step behind and follow. God shares this with man. These moments, this authority, this position, I've said it a million times, but really think about it. When God's getting honor and glory, we're getting the blessing. Can you imagine the nerves of Saul as he's like, we got 330,000 men here. I want you to go here. I want you to go here. We're going to go in the morning. Never doing it before. The Spirit's in him, but guess what? He's still flesh. Jesus was still flesh. He still has the fleshly doubt, the fleshly nerves, the fleshly anxiety. Never done it before. Never led anything much more than a herd. Had he ever fought another man for his own life? That's rapid change. But God stilled the anxiety as he does with all of us when we're going through times of trying. There's a calmness that comes over us that we can't describe, that only we have. This was yet again another instance, I believe, of God sharing his victory with sinful man. This enemy, the Ammonites, there in the morning, they weren't up early. They didn't have the same anxiety. They didn't have the same worries, the same intensity that Saul was going to meet them with. They probably didn't even think they were going to break a sweat that day. God had given such a complete, such a thorough victory to Israel, to Jabesh, that this first king comes in and there's not even 2 enemies that can be found together. There's not even another man to encourage that man. That's what that verse reads. They were left in despair. They were hiding, and this man, it's not like you see so-and-so go by, oh, can you believe what happened? You don't have anybody to talk to. You're left with yourself, with your own thoughts, no encouragement from anyone else. God brought the victory, and it was God's success, but God shared it with his people. God shared it with his first king, and he would be looked at differently from this point on. At least for the moment, we have a new king, a king that fought our wars of Israel with God's command, and there was hope in the nation of Israel. Saul of Gibeah of the tribe of Benjamin was showing a leadership and a readiness. This was a day of hope for Israel. Now, if you read Judges 19 through 21, like we talked about last week, there was an unspoken alliance between Jabesh Gilead and the tribe of Benjamin. It's actually over half the Benjamites that remained after Israel had judged Benjamin. They went in and they wiped them out. Their wives came from Jabesh Gilead. And Judges 21, verse 14, if you want to study that. But it says most of the mothers of the tribe of Benjamin were the daughters of Jabesh Gilead. This meant something. If you'll turn to 1 Samuel 31, just a few chapters ahead, I want us to see the tie between these two. 31, verse 13. Well, let's read 11 through 13. This is Saul dies, this first king dies, and it says, "And when the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead heard of that which the Philistines had done to Saul, all the valiant men arose and went all night, and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan, and came to Jabesh, and burnt them there. And they took their bones and buried them under a tree at Jabesh, and fasted 7 days." There was a tie before Saul came along, and there was a tie now, and there would be a tie after. There was a tie or a bond here, and this day's victory certified that. Jabesh Gilead was very loyal to Saul. We're going to speed through the rest of this chapter this morning, so hopefully we can get to the next chapter next week. All right, verse 12. It says, "And the people said unto Samuel, Who is he that said, Shall Saul reign over us? Bring the men, that we may put them to death." There's been a great victory, and the eyes of the people were spared. The God of Israel has been raised up. And they say to Samuel, we heard that there are those that didn't support Saul. Now, we heard it before the victory, but it bothers us now. That's what they're saying. We done nothing about it before, but now there's victory, and also we got a little adrenaline going. Let's keep it going a little further. Let's go put those men to death. Saul has proven himself to us. We were victorious today. Fighting was easy. Where are these men? Now, these men didn't have the courage to stand up for Saul until the victory. Be careful who you call friend. Now they want to show their allegiance. Now there's something to gain. Now they want to be friendly. Never forget the people that were there for you when no one else was, because there's a good chance they're going to be the only ones there for you later in life. Saul died alone. Think about that. You know, it would have been easy for Saul to have overheard this and to step in and to take this moment and to take this momentum to get what he wanted and to make it about him. Don't judge him, because we all do that. Let's not make the victory or even the trials about Jason. The victory and the trial is about the God of Jason. That was his response. You know, real quick, I want to say this before we read on to the next verse. Saul had a victory. The Spirit was in him. And he was humble enough to take it and to realize the moment he was in and make it about God. You think he missed that later on in life? I know he did. All right, verse 13. It says, "And Saul said, There shall not a man be put to death this day, for today the Lord hath wrought salvation in Israel." Who is this man speaking? Who didn't even know who Samuel was, who had never been in the sacrifice, and now he's got the wisdom to say this? It doesn't say Samuel answered. They address Samuel in 12, but it says Saul answered in 13. He didn't wait for Samuel to talk. The Spirit of the Lord, the wisdom, the knowledge was there, and he stomped it out before the problem could spread. He said, no, today's not about me. Today's not about Israel's war on Israel. Today, God brought salvation. We just need to slow down and think about that. This wasn't about him. It wasn't about man. He said, I didn't bring the victory this day. This victory, God wrought salvation. We need to praise him. We need to get angry at his enemies. We need to stand up for his name. This isn't a day for us to look at the problems we have against each other. This is God's day. Whoa. And we judge Saul for not being a very good king. He's a lot better man than I am right now, I can tell you that. Don't make your family, don't make this church, don't make this country, don't make your job about yourself. That's a lesson we can learn from Saul right there. It's not about us, it's about our God. You can call him our God. You can call him my God. That within itself is more than we deserve. Just to cut to the chase at the end study maybe of Saul's life that we're going to get to do later on. Never think you're going to be on top forever like we studied in Proverbs last week. I think the biggest thing I can say about Saul, and I'm getting ahead of myself, but I The point needs to be made. As we grow in this life, if God allows us to live till we're 85, hopefully we get better each day. We get wiser. We serve Him better each day. The shame in Saul's life is it went backwards. His best times were in the beginning. He didn't finish well. That's a topic for another day. But it's sad. If this is as close as I'm going to be with God today, I want tomorrow to be better. That's something to strive for. It's not about us. It's how far from this moment would Saul get? That's the sad part. We read David, and then you hear Bathsheba, you're like, no, David, don't do it. How about when Saul makes that sacrifice when Samuel's not there? How about when he doesn't listen and wipe out the king? Because he had a great start. We do not sustain ourselves. God has made you great if you're great. Saul eventually, I think, would figure out that this earthly kingdom, this kingship, was not made for a Benjamite. And he knew he didn't have a chance, but he wouldn't let go. You know, a question, and I'm not going to answer it. Could it be that we're only qualified for a moment? Would you have a problem with that if you were? If God got honor and glory in that moment? If Saul was only qualified for a matter of a few years? If God only gave him wisdom and knowledge for a few years, knowing what was going to happen later? Saul says, no, this day is a day to be joyful. We're triumphant, to praise God. It's not a day to turn to our own motives. It's a day to be encouraged in God's motives, to encourage others. God shared something, and He was allowing the people to see Saul differently. Saul was now viewed as king, a man they could get behind. And this is all going to tie in the next week. He was someone with authority, someone with power, someone who could help them, but also someone who could make a law and say, if you don't show up, this is the penalty. For time's sake, let's look at the last two verses together. And we're going to study these verses next week, or at least we're going to refer back to them. It says, Then said Samuel to the people, Come and let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. And all the people went to Gilgal, and there they made Saul king before the Lord in Gilgal, and there they sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord. And there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. Samuel was right there the entire time, is the way this verse reads. He wasn't as involved as Saul, but he was there. He wasn't on the front lines. He was an older man. He probably didn't want to march that 60 miles as fast as they did. But he says, let's go to Gilgal and let's renew the kingdom. The reason he's saying that is because of what we're going to study next week. But this was important because this was something that Saul could not say. This had to be said by no one else than Samuel. It needed to come from someone else. A humble man's not going to go and set himself up. So Saul calls the people to Gilgal. They sacrifice for the victory given, for the king they asked for. It's a time of great rejoicing. It was an occasion that needed to be taken to worship God. Worship was needed. It's always needed. We always have an occasion. But we could say this was a proper time of thanksgiving. Don't miss the opportunities for worship. If you didn't show up to this war, you missed the opportunity for worship. You didn't show up to the call. To make Saul king before the Lord. I got mixed feelings about this verse. God already did that. This was almost, to me, this almost reads as this is the people's acceptance of Saul, the king they asked for, the king God chose, and now they were accepting him. That's my opinion. The renewing would be another chance for Samuel to show his resignation to the people, perhaps. This is the renewing. This is the way you're going. And we're going to see that next week. This was also a time of reviving for the nation of Israel, to show that they would praise God, that they knew how to praise God. They were practicing to know how to praise God, a revival to be restored. It's a time to remember of where they came from, that God chose them, that God is in fact their God. And it's a time of thanksgiving for a victory. How many times do we ask for something and then we never stop to say thank you? Give me health. And you think, God, hey, thanks for the health I had yesterday. You asked for it. He granted it. Did we stop to worship? All right, let's end there this week. Either way, it was important for the people to be renewed if it was only for a short time, because God was the main focus. The last few verses, again, will tie in. A lot of people look at chapter 12, just kind of giving you a sneak peek as Samuel reissuing his resignation or his time on earth. He knows it's coming short. So that's why those verses matter at the end of chapter 11. So, Brother Brian, would you dismiss us?